She was the highest paid woman in America, a movie star who wrote her own material, controlled her own image, and said exactly what she wanted when she wanted. Then Hollywood decided she'd gone too far. This is the story of charm, sex, and controversy, the fall of Mae West. To understand Mae West's fall, you first need to understand just how high she'd climbed. By 1933, she was saving Paramount Pictures from bankruptcy. The studio was hemorrhaging money during the Depression, closing theaters, laying off staff, on the verge of collapse. Then Mae West showed up, and suddenly everyone wanted to go to the movies again. She was 40 years old when she made her first film, which was ancient by Hollywood standards for a female star. Most actresses were washed up by 35, considered too old to play romantic leads, shuffled off to character parts, or forgotten entirely. But West had spent decades perfecting her craft on vaudeville stages and Broadway, writing her own plays, developing her persona. When she finally arrived in Hollywood, she knew exactly who she was and what she was selling. West hadn't lived an easy life before Hollywood discovered her. She'd been performing since childhood, touring in vaudeville with her family, learning the business from the ground up. By her 20s, she was writing her own material, pushing boundaries even then. In 1926, she wrote and starred in a play called Sex on Broadway, and it got her arrested on morals charges. She spent 8 days in jail, and the publicity made her more famous than the play had. That pattern would repeat throughout her career. Controversy leading to publicity leading to success. She understood that being talked about, even negatively, was better than being ignored. When censors or critics attacked her, she'd respond with a witty comeback that got quoted in newspapers, keeping her name in circulation. She was manipulating media attention decades before anyone called it public relations. Her Broadway play Diamond Lil in 1928 was a massive hit, running for months and establishing the character that would define her career. Lil was a saloon singer in the 1890s, confident and sexual, who knew how to handle men and wasn't apologetic about it. The play's success is what brought Hollywood calling, though it took them years to figure out how to use her. And what she was selling was something American audiences had never quite seen before. West played women who enjoyed their sexuality, who pursued men rather than waiting to be pursued, who made suggestive jokes and didn't apologize for them. Her famous lines became part of the national vocabulary. She'd deliver them with a knowing smile, a raised eyebrow, a slight pause that made the innuendo unmistakable. Her first major film was She Done Him Wrong in 1933, and it was a phenomenon. Made for a tiny budget, it earned millions, and those millions saved Paramount. The studio executives who'd been skeptical about this middle-aged blonde with the hourglass figure and the Brooklyn accent suddenly realized they had a gold mine on their hands. They put her in another film immediately, I'm No Angel, and it made even more money. West had a clause in her contract that let her write or rewrite her own dialogue, which was unheard of for actors at the time, especially women. She'd take the scripts the studio gave her and rework them, adding her signature wit, her double entendres, her particular rhythm of speech. Directors learned quickly that you didn't tell Mae West what to do. You gave her the parameters and let her work. She understood her image completely. The tight dresses, the slow walk, the bedroom voice, the blonde curls, all of it was calculated. She'd spent years watching what worked and what didn't, testing material in front of live audiences, refining her character. By the time she got to Hollywood, Mae West wasn't just playing a role. She'd become the role, or the role had become her. The line between performer and performance had blurred until it was almost invisible. But that image, that persona, that willingness to talk openly about sex and desire made her dangerous in the eyes of certain people. America in the early 1930s was conflicted about morality. The Depression had loosened some social constraints. People needed escape, needed entertainment, needed to forget their troubles for a couple hours in a dark theater. But at the same time, there was this powerful movement pushing for more censorship, more control over what Americans could see and hear. The Catholic Church was leading this charge. They'd formed the Legion of Decency in 1933, and their whole purpose was to pressure Hollywood into cleaning up movies. They'd rate films, organize boycotts, threaten theater owners. They had real power because they represented millions of Catholics who would obey when church leaders told them not to see certain films. Mae West became their primary target. Everything she represented offended them. A woman who was sexual, who was in control, who made jokes about men and religion and morality. She was exactly what the Legion of Decency wanted to eliminate from American screens. They started organizing campaigns against her films, writing letters, putting pressure on Paramount and on the newly strengthened Production Code Administration. The Production Code had actually existed since 1930, but nobody paid much attention to it at first. Studios would submit scripts, get notes about what needed to change, then ignore most of those notes and release the films anyway. But by 1934, the code was being enforced seriously. Joseph Breen, a devout Catholic, was put in charge, and he meant business. Films now had to get code approval, or they wouldn't be shown in most American theaters. The code's rules were incredibly detailed and restrictive. No profanity, no nudity, no ridicule of religion, no depictions of illegal drug use, no inference of sexual perversion, no scenes of passion that might stimulate the lower emotions. Marriage had to be held sacred. Adultery and illicit sex couldn't be made attractive or justified. Methods of crime couldn't be explicitly shown. The list went on and on. For someone like Mae West, who built her career on sexual suggestion and pushing against social norms, these rules were impossible to work within. Her entire act was about stimulating those lower emotions the code wanted to suppress. Her characters were often involved in relationships outside of marriage. Her jokes relied on making audiences think about sex without saying it directly. The code was designed to eliminate exactly what made her popular. Breen himself seemed to have a particular obsession with controlling Mae West. He'd write long memos about her scripts, going line by line to identify anything that might be interpreted as sexual. He'd attend screenings of her films and demand changes to scenes that had already been shot. He made it his personal mission to ensure that Mae West's films conformed to his vision of morality. West's 1934 film Belle of the 90s was the first to face serious code interference. The original title was It Ain't No Sin, which Breen found offensive. He made them change it. Then he went through the script line by line, cutting anything he considered too sexual, too suggestive, too inappropriate. West fought back, found ways to sneak things past him, but the battle was exhausting and she didn't always win. You could see the difference in her films after 1934. They were still entertaining, she was still Mae West, but something had been neutered. The edge was gone. The jokes were softer, more coded, less direct. She was having to hint at things she'd previously said outright. For an artist whose whole power came from her directness, from her willingness to say what everyone else just thought, this was creative death. Her co-stars changed too. In her early films, she'd been paired with younger men, handsome leading men who played off her confident sexuality, but the code enforcers worried this sent the wrong message: an older woman pursuing younger men. So they started pairing her with Cary Grant and other actors closer to her age, or they made her play more maternal roles, less overtly sexual ones. The 1936 film Klondike Annie caused another massive controversy. West played a woman who escapes from a bad situation and ends up impersonating a missionary. The Catholic Church was outraged. A woman of questionable morals pretending to be a religious figure? They organized boycotts, wrote letters, demanded the film be pulled from theaters. Some cities banned it. Paramount was terrified of losing the Catholic audience, which was huge and loyal. William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate, banned any mention of Mae West in his papers. She'd supposedly made a joke about his mistress at some party, and he'd taken offense. For years, Hearst's papers, which were read by millions, wouldn't review her films, wouldn't run her interviews, wouldn't acknowledge her existence. For someone whose career depended on publicity, this was devastating. West's 1937 film Every Day's a Holiday performed poorly at the box office. The code restrictions had watered down her material so much that audiences weren't sure what they were getting anymore. She wasn't the bold, brazen Mae West they loved, but she wasn't respectable enough for the people who'd been offended by her. She'd fallen into this middle ground where nobody was happy, and then came the moment that really damaged her career, maybe irrevocably. In December 1937, West appeared on ventriloquist Edgar Bergen's radio show. Bergen's dummy, Charlie McCarthy, was wildly popular, and the show was family-friendly entertainment. West agreed to do a sketch, a Garden of Eden parody where she played Eve and Charlie played Adam. The sketch itself wasn't particularly shocking by modern standards, or even by Mae West standards. Eve flirted with Adam in her typical suggestive way, made some jokes about forbidden fruit and temptation, used her trademark delivery to imply more than she actually said. It was vintage Mae West, which was exactly the problem. On film, adults could choose whether to see her movies. On radio, she was coming into people's homes uninvited. The reaction was swift and furious. The NBC network received thousands of complaint letters within days. Church groups organized protest campaigns. Newspapers ran editorials about the decline of moral standards in American entertainment. Politicians threatened to hold hearings about radio regulation. The Federal Communications Commission, which had the power to revoke broadcasting licenses, let it be known they were paying attention. Mae West was banned from radio. Not from that show, not from that network, from all of radio. For years, she couldn't appear on any radio program in America. This was before television was widespread, so radio was how stars stayed connected with audiences between films. Being banned from radio meant being cut off from millions of potential fans. The ban wasn't just official policy, it was enforced through fear. Networks didn't want to risk their licenses. Sponsors didn't want to be associated with controversy. Other performers didn't want to be seen as defending her. Even mentioning Mae West on the radio became risky. She'd been essentially erased from a major entertainment medium at the height of her fame. The damage to her reputation was severe. She'd gone from being risky and exciting to being genuinely scandalous, someone that major corporations wouldn't touch. Paramount, which had been saved by her films just 5 years earlier, didn't renew her contract. Other studios weren't interested. At 45, Mae West's film career was essentially over. She didn't work in movies again until 1943, when she made The Heat's On, and it was a disaster. The production code restrictions were even tighter by then. World War II had changed what audiences wanted, and West's style felt dated. The film lost money. She wouldn't make another movie for 27 years. Those decades between 1943 and 1970 were strange for West. She wasn't retired. She performed in nightclubs, touring with a show she'd written, surrounded by young muscle men who served as her backup dancers and, according to rumors, her lovers. She was making money, staying visible, but she wasn't the cultural force she'd been in the 30s. The nightclub act was pure Mae West, refined and concentrated. She'd emerge in elaborate gowns covered in sequins and diamonds, real diamonds according to her. The muscle men would carry her on stage, flex and pose around her, serve as props for her jokes. She'd sing a few songs in that distinctive voice, tell her classic stories, make the old jokes that audiences had come to hear. It was part Vegas spectacle, part museum exhibit. Some nights the audiences were genuinely enthusiastic, thrilled to see a living legend, happy to participate in the nostalgia. Other nights you could sense a sadness in the room, people watching someone who couldn't let go of past glory. West herself seemed oblivious to any sadness, performing with the same confidence she'd always had, convinced she was still the star she'd been 30 years earlier. She was meticulous about her appearance, spending hours on makeup and hair, wearing corsets and foundation garments to maintain her famous figure. The blonde curls never changed, the white gowns never changed, the slow walk never changed. She'd created this image in her 20s, and she'd carry it to her grave, refusing to acknowledge that time had passed. The nightclub shows kept her name alive, especially among gay audiences who appreciated her camp sensibility and her rejection of conventional femininity. She'd become a cult figure, someone young people knew about from their parents, someone who represented a more scandalous, exciting version of old Hollywood. But she wasn't a working film actress anymore. Las Vegas became her home base. She'd perform regularly at various hotels, doing essentially the same show year after year. She'd wear elaborate gowns, make her classic jokes, be carried on stage on a litter by muscular men. It was part performance art, part nostalgia act, part defiant refusal to fade away quietly. The audiences loved it, but it was also kind of sad. This brilliant performer stuck in a loop, recreating her past rather than creating new work. In 1970, at age 77, West returned to film in Myra Breckenridge, playing a talent agent. The film was meant to be transgressive, based on a controversial novel by Gore Vidal. But it was a mess, neither funny nor sexy, just uncomfortable. Critics savaged it. West's performance was the least of its problems, but being associated with such a notorious flop didn't help her legacy. She made one final film, Sextet, in 1978. She was 84, playing a woman on her sixth honeymoon, surrounded by younger men. It was surreal and uncomfortable and barely got released. Critics were cruel, not just about the film, but about West herself, mocking her age, her appearance, her refusal to accept that her time had passed. The film became a punchline, something people referenced as an example of Hollywood delusion. West died in 1980 at age 87. The obituaries were respectful but mixed. They acknowledged her impact in the 30s, her groundbreaking control over her career, her influence on comedy and on Hollywood's treatment of sexuality. But they also noted the long decline, the decades of diminishing returns, the sad spectacle of her final films. What's fascinating looking back is how much Mae West accomplished and how thoroughly the industry punished her for it. She was writing her own material when women weren't supposed to write. She was controlling her image when actors were supposed to do what studios told them. She was talking openly about sex and desire when women were supposed to be modest and demure. The production code didn't just censor her films, it was specifically designed to stop artists like her. The rules about how women could be portrayed, about what could be said or implied about sex, about morality and punishment, these rules targeted exactly the kind of character West played. The code's enforcers wanted women on screen to be either virtuous or punished for their lack of virtue. West's characters were neither. Her influence on future performers was enormous, even if she never got proper credit for it. Marilyn Monroe borrowed heavily from West's persona. The breathy voice, the knowing sexuality, the humor about her own image. Madonna studied West, understanding how she'd manipulated her public image and turned controversy into profit. Every female comedian who's made jokes about sex owes something to Mae West, but West never got to see that influence properly acknowledged during her lifetime. By the 1960s and 1970s, when a new generation of women in entertainment were benefiting from the paths she'd cleared, West was seen as a relic, a curiosity from a bygone era. The women's liberation movement didn't claim her as a pioneer, possibly because her feminism was unconventional, focused on individual pleasure and power rather than collective political action. The gay community embraced her more fully than any other group. Her exaggerated femininity, her camp sensibility, her defiance of sexual norms made her a queer icon. She'd employed gay men in her shows, refused to condemn homosexuality when it was still illegal and widely despised, created characters that resonated with people who didn't fit conventional gender expectations. That part of her legacy remained strong. Looking at photographs of Mae West from different decades, you can see the tragedy of how Hollywood treats women. In 1933, she's powerful, in control, radiating confidence. By 1943, there's something desperate in her eyes, a need to prove she's still relevant. By the 1970s, she's become almost a parody of herself, clinging to an image from 40 years earlier because the industry never gave her the chance to evolve. Male stars from her era got to age gracefully, to transition into character roles, to be celebrated as elder statesmen. Cary Grant, who co-starred with West in She Done Him Wrong and I'm No Angel, worked steadily for decades, played romantic leads into his 60s, retired on his own terms. Mae West was pushed out before she turned 50, and when she tried to come back, she was mocked for refusing to disappear. The financial side of her story is important too. At her peak, West was making enormous money, enough to be financially independent for life. That independence meant she could turn down roles, could refuse to do material she didn't like, could maintain some control even as the industry turned against her. But it also meant she didn't have to work. And without regular work, her skills atrophied and audiences moved on. She invested in real estate, lived comfortably in Los Angeles, surrounded herself with younger men who served various purposes, some professional, some personal. She maintained the Mae West persona even in private, or so people who knew her claimed. She'd wear white even at home, keep the apartment decorated in white and gold, refuse to discuss her real age or her real background. The character had consumed the person. There's debate about how aware West was of her own decline. Some people who worked with her in her later years said she genuinely believed she was still the star she'd been in the 30s, that she couldn't see how the industry had changed or how her appeal had diminished. Others said she knew exactly what was happening but refused to give up, kept pushing forward out of sheer stubbornness. Her last interview, given not long before her death, showed flashes of the old wit and confidence. She talked about her career matter-of-factly, defended her choices, expressed no regrets. If she felt bitter about how things had ended, she didn't show it. She'd played Mae West until the very end, never breaking character, never admitting weakness or defeat. The question of what Mae West could have been if the code hadn't been enforced so strictly is impossible to answer. Would she have remained a major star through the 1940s and 1950s? Would she have evolved, found new material, adapted to changing times? Or was her appeal always going to be limited, tied to a specific moment when audiences were ready for her brand of sexual liberation, but only for a few years? What's certain is that the code's restrictions hurt her more than almost any other star of her era. Other actors could tone down their material, could adapt to the new rules without losing what made them special. West's entire appeal was based on saying what wasn't supposed to be said. Once that was taken away, she was still talented, still charismatic, but she wasn't Mae West anymore. She was a sanitized version, and audiences could sense the difference. The Catholic Church's campaign against her was remarkably successful. They didn't just get her film censored, they made her socially unacceptable. For years in certain circles, admitting you enjoyed Mae West's movies was seen as admitting to low moral standards. Parents who'd laughed at her jokes in 1933 told their children in 1937 that she was vulgar and inappropriate. The cultural shift happened that quickly. Radio's ban of her was particularly cruel because it was based on one incident, one sketch that wasn't notably worse than things she'd done in her films. But radio was more tightly regulated than film, more accessible to children, and more susceptible to pressure from religious groups. The networks were terrified of losing their broadcasting licenses, so they threw Mae West overboard without hesitation. The irony is that by today's standards, West's material is pretty tame. Her famous double entendres are clever, but hardly shocking. Modern audiences watching her 1930s films are often surprised by how restrained she actually was, how much of her humor relied on suggestion and audience imagination rather than explicit content. The controversy seems overblown in retrospect, but that's judging by modern standards. In 1930s America, West was genuinely transgressive. She was challenging fundamental assumptions about how women should behave, how sex should be discussed, who got to control female sexuality. The people who opposed her weren't being unreasonable by their own lights. She really was threatening their worldview. The tragedy is that the threat she posed was largely positive. West's characters showed women as full human beings with desires and agency. They suggested that enjoying sex didn't make a woman immoral or worthless. They presented female sexuality as something natural and healthy rather than dangerous and shameful. These weren't radical ideas, but they were ahead of their time and the culture wasn't ready for them. If West had emerged 20 years later after the sexual revolution of the 1960s, she might have been celebrated as a pioneer, embraced by feminists, given the artistic freedom to develop her craft. If she'd emerged 20 years earlier before the code existed, she might have worked steadily through the 1920s and retired gracefully in the 1930s. But she hit Hollywood at exactly the wrong moment, just early enough to become a huge star, just late enough to be crushed by the backlash. Her fall wasn't gradual, it was sudden and brutal. In 1936, she was still a major star. By 1938, she couldn't get hired. The speed of it must have been shocking even to someone as confident as West. One year you're saving a studio from bankruptcy, the next year they won't return your calls. Hollywood has always been fickle, but this was more than fickleness. This was a coordinated effort to eliminate a particular kind of performer from American entertainment. Mae West fought back the only way she knew how, by refusing to change, by maintaining her persona, by continuing to perform even when the venues got smaller and the audiences got older. She never apologized, never admitted she'd done anything wrong, never tried to reinvent herself as something more acceptable. That stubbornness was admirable but also limiting. She could have evolved, could have found new ways to work within the system, but she chose defiance instead. Whether that was the right choice is debatable. She maintained her dignity and her principles, but she also spent 4 decades largely disconnected from the film industry she'd once dominated. She performed for devoted fans, made decent money, lived comfortably, but she never recaptured the cultural influence she'd had in the early 30s. She became a symbol rather than a working artist, and symbols don't develop or grow. The legacy Mae West left is complicated. She proved that a woman could control her own career and become incredibly successful. She showed that audiences would respond to frank discussions of sexuality if they were handled with humor and intelligence. She influenced countless performers who came after her, but she also demonstrated how quickly and thoroughly Hollywood could turn on someone who pushed too hard against the boundaries. Her story is a reminder that progress isn't linear. The early 1930s were in some ways more permissive than the late 1930s and 1940s. The code enforcement represented a step backward, a reassertion of Victorian morality in response to the relative freedom of the pre-code era. Mae West's career was caught in that shift, and she never recovered from it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.